just, like, once it hits 4:30, you just begin it rather than me introducing it. Okay? So
Yeah. I don't have a clock on me. 29? Okay.
you've got 1 minute.
Okay.
I'll
Yeah.
tell you when to start.
That sounds good. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Grace Messimer, and I'm a student at Dickinson College. As we begin, we acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples who lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School beginning in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of Dickinson College, I welcome all of you to our symposium, Science-Based Choices for Climate Action, Insights from the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Our audience includes those who are physically present with us here on Dickinson College's campus. We also have a virtual audience of over 2,000 people who are watching the live stream across the United States and in 30 other countries. Thank you for joining us to participate in this event. There will be an opportunity for audience members to ask questions during the session. You are welcome to ask questions at that time. Members of the virtual audience may ask questions by typing them into the live stream chat. Dickinson College welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior and harassment will not be tolerated. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In case of an emergency, we have a main exit to the left, as well as some up the stairs, and there is a handicap accessible exit behind the curtains that we will move if necessary in any case. We will begin this closing session of the symposium with a keynote address from Ko Barrett, Vice Chair of the IPCC and a Senior Climate Policy Advisor to the United States government. Her keynote address will be followed by a panel discussion about climate action and policy at local to global scales. I am honored to be introducing Ms. Barrett today for this address on climate action and policy. As a double major in political science and environmental studies, I have spent the past 3 years learning about the importance of environmental policy and the role I would like to play in it someday. Last fall, as a Dickinson Baird Sustainability Fellow, I had the opportunity to engage in climate action at the local level. Working with other Baird Fellows and with Cumberland County officials, we assessed climate change vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation options for the county. Working on the project and writing in depth about social vulnerability and climate justice provided me the opportunity to understand how those issues impact our local community. In the coming year, other students will build on this work to assist the county in developing strategies to build local climate resilience. It is exciting for me to be here introducing somebody who has been a leader for climate science and action, both nationally and internationally. And as someone who views climate change as the most pressing issue of our time, I'm thankful for the opportunity to attend the symposium this week and learn from all of the speakers I have heard on my college campus. Less than 2 weeks from today, delegates from more than 190 nations will attend COP27, or more formally, the 27th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where they will negotiate next steps in implementing the Paris Climate Agreement. In her keynote talk, Ms. Barrett will speak on the findings and messages from the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report that are critical for delegates of COP27 to hear and understand as they negotiate the future of our world. Ms. Barrett currently serves as the Senior Advisor for Climate for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Vice Chair of the IPCC. She became one of the first women in this role in 2015. Ms. Barrett has worked for 2 decades to represent the United States in climate adaptation negotiations for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She has also worked in negotiating the global framework for climate services with the World Meteorological Organization. In her career with NOAA, Ms. Barrett was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Programs and Administration in the Office of Research and held leadership positions in its Climate Program Office. Prior to joining NOAA, she was the Director of the Global Climate Change Program at the U.S. Agency for International Development and oversaw climate activities in more than 40 countries. I had the chance to meet Ms. Barrett earlier this week and speak to her about her career. Hearing about the hard work and the journey she has taken to be in this position at the IPCC was moving to me. I appreciated her insight into working in climate science as well as her kindness towards me when we met. And I'm sure that her optimism and commitment to global community work regarding climate change will continue to inspire many, including myself. And now, please join me in welcoming Ko Barrett to the podium.
Grace, such a nice introduction. And I'm really happy that you shared a little bit about yourself and your work, because I think that's important. But I will say up front that I'm not going to talk about what Grace said I was going to talk about, so sorry, Grace. Okay, but let me first start by saying, Neil, we owe you, Dickinson College leadership, and your team a huge thank you for assembling this fabulous symposium. Each and every session provided us with global perspectives and local understanding grounded in practical knowledge. And I'm so glad you have recorded each one of these conversations so we can go back to them again and again to rediscover the many insights and to, frankly, be re-inspired again. For those of you in the room and online, know that there is a wealth of information available to you in case you were not able to join us live for the entirety of the symposium. So the talk was intended to be focused on what Grace shared, which was critical findings from the IPCC for international climate negotiations. But I am going to invoke my prerogative as the final keynote speaker to take a slightly different tack and reflect on the rich conversation that we have had here these past 3 days, and to try to distill some of the many important messages that certainly comport with IPCC findings, are relevant to the big picture climate negotiations, but hopefully give us all the motivation to act in effective and powerful ways. So you probably have heard, and certainly if you've been participating today, this symposium, you have heard how the IPCC is a unique collaboration between scientists and policymakers. Hundreds of scientists volunteer their time to assess the vast amounts of research and knowledge that exists on climate change. They work with governments to help shape the assessment of that knowledge into policy-relevant information that can underpin action. This partnership between governments and scientists is not a liability, it is the IPCC's superpower. By creating consensus at the science and policy interface, the IPCC reports give a gigantic stamp of approval that ensures the scientific information in the report is useful in shaping climate policy and spurring climate action. And that's why these reports get so much attention. But I'll say this, for me, the conversations that we've had here have done a similar thing. We've combined science knowledge with policy understanding in ways that have shown us real models to follow and real concerns to tackle through, as Professor Lee said, real stories from this area. And the sessions have taken us beyond the global scale understanding to the local, university, community, city, state-level discussions that empower each of us to be, as Neil said this morning, partners in solutions. That aspect of the symposium, the grounding of science and policy in this place, has been one of the most profoundly rewarding things about this symposium. And these conversations have reinforced for me the idea that cities, communities, and universities provide just the right level of engagement to magnify individual ambition and motivate action. There is a groundswell of interest right now to do something about the climate problem. But many people feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge, and just making individual dietary choices, energy choices, fashion, transport, these changes feel a little bit too disconnected from the huge transformation we heard about today that is needed to make a difference. But changes in your community, working in places you care about, this is an opportunity to make a tangible difference. And by the way, to disconnect from the fits and starts of national policy, which can sometimes pendulum wildly. So I'm like a big believer in subnational action because I believe it can have real, lasting, positive effects. And honestly, this is a major takeaway for me from our time together, this symposium. So digging in a little bit, from IPCC and sessions here, we learned about 5 key strategies for getting net zero greenhouse gas emissions. lowering energy demand, electrifying buildings, vehicles, industry, and making the mountains of electricity we need from renewable energy. And we heard about the importance of reducing non-CO2 gases, such as methane, and removing CO2 from the atmosphere. But importantly, we saw this in action in the session about how Dickinson College achieved net zero emissions. Talk about going from science to policy to action. That's the real deal right there. And we heard from the sessions focused on land and ecosystems, food, agriculture, and water. People and ecosystems are deeply connected. Nature's services support all aspects of our lives, and the loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, especially for indigenous people and local communities who directly depend on these services. But importantly, we learned that many of you in this audience are working to provide food and protect ecosystems by things like fostering bees, by creating pollinator gardens, student farming, and protecting watersheds. And we learned about how quickly this world is urbanizing and that cities and communities present a huge opportunity as potential hubs for climate action. The session yesterday on cities drove that point home for us quite well. As Karen Cito said, we cannot solve climate change without the cities that exist now undergoing significant transformations, and the cities that are yet to come embarking on a strikingly different path. Cities and other urban areas account for more than 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions if you take into account the production and consumption associated with folks who live in cities. So there's a significant potential for emissions reductions, and there's a real potential for adapting to climate change while creating more livable cities with green spaces and such. And as my colleague Deborah Roberts so vibrantly brought to life, we learned about the obligation we all have to ensure that climate solutions are solutions for everyone, that climate solutions are sustainable development solutions. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. These are across large parts of Africa, as well as South Asia, Central and South America, and there are hotspots in this country as well. In these hotspots, overlapping challenges include limited access to water, sanitation, and health services. And we don't have to make the choice between climate or health. We need to think about solutions that are and solutions, climate and health, and water, and equity. And let's stay on the topic of equity for a second, because it was a rich theme that rode an undercurrent throughout this entire symposium, including in the last session. In just about every session, students asked about or stressed diversity. There were questions about gender and geographic representation, robust discussions about indigenous knowledge, resulting in, as has been mentioned earlier today, a student asking about including tribal nations in the IPCC author nominating process, a direct way to ensure that indigenous knowledge and indigenous concerns are reflected in our reports. And I have to say that the topics of equity, diversity, and inclusion are near and dear to my heart. We need people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives working to solve the complex problem of climate change. We need thinking outside of the box to innovate, not just technologically, but sociologically. And I really loved Tim Carter's call this morning to diversify to unify, and the whole conversation on the people-centered framework for transformational change and just transition that we had this afternoon. And of course, I have to mention the important role of youth as scientists, as communicators and advocates, and as eventual custodians of this fragile planet of ours. This symposium has been a fantastic example of youth leadership. Yes, you, Grace. And my hope is to see the faces of you and your peers participating as scientists, authors, as policymakers during the next IPCC assessment cycle, but also in all of the climate processes at the subnational, national, and international level as we push for action this critical decade. So I guess what I'm trying to stress here is, and I'll just end with this thought, is that this is what science to policy to action looks like. It is understanding the big picture, while seeing that the action on the front lines is what makes the difference. It's embracing diversity and keeping the needs of the most vulnerable and the generations to come front and center as we solve this problem. And it's using our voices to enact the change that we want to see. So I just will end with a thank you to the students, the faculty members, members of the local and global community who were able to participate. I couldn't imagine a more successful conference or a better way to celebrate the Rose Waters Prize for advancing responsible action on behalf of the planet, its resources, animals, and people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ko. I think this was an extraordinary address, really delivered to our students, for our students. We really appreciate that. Yeah, we have a panel here of really very dedicated, passionate people who are working on climate change in different capacities, at different scales of action. So Ko's going to continue with us on the panel. Fatima Denton, who was introduced in the last session, spoke in the last session, so I won't do another introduction of Fatima, but she's going to be part of this conversation. We've got Sam Robinson here with us at the table. Sam is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Wolf of Pennsylvania. He's been involved in a variety of environmental conservation aspects of that, including being involved in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There are probably some other things that I could talk about, but I won't. We're going to get into things quickly here. We've got online here remotely, we've got Will Bernstein, who's going to participate remotely. Will was going to be here with us in person, and he is under the weather and is sparing us from exposure to we don't know what, but so he's persevering and joining us remotely despite not feeling at his best. So as you just heard, Ko kind of threw out her instructions of what to do and said, I'm going to do something different. And so in the spirit of that, we're throwing out the script for this session as well. And so what's going to happen here is I've got one or two questions that I'm going to ask our panelists. And then it's going to come back to you in the audience, both in the room here and the virtual audience. And we're going to set aside the 10 or so questions we had prepared in advance, and we're going to just immediately go to you. And you may ask a question, or you may answer a question, or share your perspective on something that you've heard the last 3 days, or that is occurring to you now. So start to think about that now. What would you like to ask, or what would you like to share about your perspective? We'd like to hear from anyone and everybody in the audience here. We'd really like to hear from our students in the audience. Just kind of bear that in mind. Also, show a little self-discipline. When you're handed a microphone, we really don't want 10 minutes of your perspective. Think of it this way, and I've been involved with a previous organization before I came to Dickinson where we would do these meetings where we would invite young PhD scholars or recent PhDs to an international science meeting with some eminent scientists giving an award, and they were given each 1 minute to talk. And the goal is you want to say some things that will make other people in the audience say, as soon as this meeting is over, I want to go find them out in the lobby and talk with them. So that will be where you get to like pontificate longer. All right. So very briefly, either ask a question or briefly share your perspective, but not a treatise. All right. Okay. So part of the decision to kind of change the plan began this morning when I woke up earlier than I intended and read the New York Times. There was the main article on the front page today was about climate change. The title of the article is "Climate Pledges Are Falling Short and a Chaotic Future Looks More Like Reality." So what the article went on to explain is at the climate conference that was held in Glasgow last year, November, I think probably, COP26, the 26th Conference of the Parties, countries pledged to redouble their efforts. Okay, whenever I hear language like that, I always kind of like, yeah, okay, redouble from what? What does that really mean? But the assessment that came out recently, reported in the New York Times, is very few countries have increased their pledges, what they're intending to do since the last conference. The COP27 is happening in, is it 2 weeks or 1 week? Something like that. That will be in Egypt. And so basically, we're falling short. So the commitments that have been made are nowhere near enough, as we heard earlier this week, to get to that, hold us below 2 degrees warming, much less 1.5 degrees. And the notion that we were going to redouble efforts is kind of petered out. And so maybe I'd like to hear a little bit, from Ko and Fatima initially about sort of what are the implications of, like, what does that mean for what's going to happen at COP27 given that context? And maybe more importantly, what does that mean for getting on one of these pathways, any of these pathways that move us towards a more positive future?
You want me to start?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. I'm conscious I should only use 5 words here in my answer. Well, here's an interesting thing about commitments under the Framework Convention. There is no compliance regime. All the commitments are basically voluntary. And so the lead up to these meetings is a time where reports like this tend to come out to spur more ambition. But last year, which was, a really big COP, UK made a big deal about that. There were a lot of pledges, and I just don't think that we're seeing exactly the same kind of level of attention to new pledges. And that's a concern, because we're not on track to hold temperature to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees by the end of this century. So it is something for us to be focused on. And it's interesting, I was interested when I read that article, Neil, that at least they acknowledged the Inflation Reduction Act piece that the U.S. put in. It doesn't extend our commitment, but it actually kind of makes firm our at least commitment to kind of trying to meet our global goal by the end of this century. But that's not enough, and it's not enough for the other countries, as you point out. Yeah.
Fatima, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, just to echo what Ko has just mentioned, I think we are definitely off track and we are definitely falling short. And I think, I think Glasgow, we all came away with some hope, at least for some of the fossil fuels like coal, which we felt was more or less in a coffin with the nails on it. And it's a shame that we have seen this sort of rebound, especially of coal, because that I think was not in the forecast. We had all hoped that was something that we can. I don't know if you remember where there was this argument about phasing out or phasing down, and there was a lot of discussions about it. Well, coal, I think, was one of those where there was a strong confidence that we could phase out rather than phase down. And it's a bit of a disappointment and unfortunate that the current geopolitical tension and the war in Ukraine and all of that has, brought demand is also quite high, and we're seeing a rebound of this fossil fuel. So that's not going to put us on the pathway that we expect, below 2 degrees. And I think it does have severe implications for some parts of the world as well. It has implications for everyone. I think no one is indifferent to this. But again, with supply chains broken, it's affecting different parts of the world. Countries in Africa have got a very high dependency on fertilizers from Ukraine, on wheat, on sunflower, and that dependency is growing. I mean, I think what it does also, it forces some of these countries to think about how they can get off these dependency sort of pathway, how they can begin to start diversifying their own resources, and realizing that some of these resources, are finite, and many will become stranded. But I think we need to get back on that pathway and on that course where we are basically looking at how we can phase out some of these fossil fuels in a way that would make sense. Obviously, as I was saying earlier in the conversation today on just transition, that with some countries, I think, where development is still a very strong prerequisite, it's important that we do this with some conscience. We do this with some leadership, and we do it also with a sense that demand for fossil fuel is very high in a lot of African countries because they see these as a gateway to their industrialization process. And many countries in Africa have got very high ambition on industrialization. And they're not necessarily talking about green industrialization. They're just talking about industrialization. So I think the importance of how they industrialize differently is something that we need to find ways of, advocating for that green industrialization, which I think could be a win-win and could show the rest of the world that this can be done. But right now, there is a sense in the other parts of the world that there is a double speak, and that countries have been talking about keeping these resources in the ground, especially natural gas, not even using it as a transition fuel because there are issues around safety that has been talked about, even though some people believe that the safety aspect is quite marginal. So there is a double speak that is, I think, that has become so manifest with the war in Ukraine that many countries in this part of the world are basically saying that, energy is a sovereign issue, and so we have rights to take advantage of our resources for the development of our people. So I think the discussion in Egypt is going to feature that issue of energy security, and also potentially it's going to cascade into other problems on food security and just general inflationary pressures that we're seeing all across the world that have been lived, I guess everyone's feeling the pinch. But some people are probably more than others. But I think it's a global problem right now. It's just that those countries that have been poorer and more sort of accustomed to these kinds of hardship are facing it doubly or triply or whatever way you want to put it. It's just become front and center. So yeah, that's what I'd say, Neil, for now. We're definitely off track, and we need to have a serious conversation on how we begin to make our way back to, a below 2 degree. So that conversation is very much needed.
All right, thank you for those thoughts, Fatima. So Sam and Will, you're working at the level of the state of Pennsylvania, Will in the city of Pittsburgh. What goes on at these international climate conferences, the pledges that are made, the discussions that are happening, do you pay attention to those? Do those matter? How do they influence what you do at the level of the state or a city? Give us some sense of whether they matter, and if so, how, in what way do you pay attention to these things?
So I guess I'd say the first level, I just want to go back to the kind of conversation about the article, because I think there's a lot to be pessimistic about there, and I think pessimism can sometimes breed inaction. And so, focusing on some of these things that have happened, the passage of major legislation in Washington that is now flooding out into the states, giving resources that we never had, getting down to the local level is really encouraging, at least where I sit. We've been able to do things and are going to be able to do things in the next few years that we've never been able to in the 8 years that I've been in the governor's office. But I think, to your question about sort of global agreements and how do we interpret them, does it matter at the state level or the local level? I think it really does, and in this way particularly, because we came into office and there was a lot of action. This was in 2015 when the governor was first elected. There was a lot of enthusiasm from EPA. They were working on the Clean Power Plan at that time, which was going to reduce emissions from the power sector. There was a lot of energy, and the Paris Agreement was signed in that year, and commitments were made, and so I think states sort of said, okay, the federal government's got this. We can, we're doing the things that we're doing, but there's a lot of energy at the federal level, and they're going to push us into doing some of the things that if we didn't have those plans on our own. So you can kind of take your foot off the gas. And then as things shifted, administrations changed, priorities changed, it really fell to the states to pick up that mantle. And I felt that very significantly during the last presidential administration when we withdrew from the Paris Agreement. It then fell to states to really pick up the slack. And so Pennsylvania is part of a group called the Climate Alliance, which was founded in 2017. 23 states and Puerto Rico, over half of the U.S. population. And really it felt sort of like climate action in exile. The states really trying to pick up where the federal administration was not doing that work. So I think it's important that goals be set, and then we all sort of collectively work to pick it up. In Pennsylvania, obviously, we've got an election coming up in a couple of weeks. If things shift, or as the new administration comes in, they don't pursue climate action with the same vigor that we did, then it'll be to Pittsburgh and the local folks and the federal government. So it's all of these levels, I think, working together to keep the ball rolling forward. If it's at the international commitment level or down to the smallest boroughs in Pennsylvania, I think it's really important that we're all contributing.
All right. So, Will, you're the climate and energy manager for the city of Pittsburgh, a city that was actually called out in presidential politics in relation to the Paris Climate Agreement in the past. How do these international discussions, conversations, agreements, how do they influence the way you approach work at the level of a city?
Yeah, Sam really hit on it with the way we reacted as a city to those international and national political changes really spurred a lot of our climate action and a lot of our commitment to climate action. So in that lack of a federal focus made local governments say, well, if the federal government's not going to do it, we're going to do what we can to try to maintain those commitments. So just like Pennsylvania is part of a climate alliance, the city of Pittsburgh was part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, a group of 25 cities committed to meeting the commitments of the Paris Accords. That's actually how I ended up in my role at the city of Pittsburgh. So I think we did react strongly to those international agreements. I think in terms of the particulars, the specifics of the kind of action that we take are not driven as much by those recommendations. I mean, it's more about just the realities of local politics and the powers of local government, that we're doing what we can. We know the rough outlines of the kind of actions we need to take. But I think that the local politicians especially respond very strongly to the immediate needs and demands of their constituents. And so to the extent that these kind of international agreements help galvanize public opinion and keep it in the front of voters' minds that we need to be acting at every level to address the climate crisis, that helps to drive action at a local level. So we need that international momentum to let our constituencies know that the work is not done, and then to demand of local governments that we continue to act on it.
Neil, can I just ask these guys? Because to what degree is the private sector putting pressure on you? Because, we hear that the certainty of the markets, which can't just switch, overnight with different political whims, impacts them, because they have to make investments over the long run. Do either of you feel pressure from the private sector to go in a direction or another?
Well, so I would say probably another is the direction that we get pushed a lot. No, I think it's heartening that more and more corporations are taking seriously sort of ESG principles and really incorporating that into their structures. I think that's kind of the cart, not the horse, right? The horse is public opinion and people demanding that of corporations, and that's the response. For us, it's sad to say, that at least at the state level, and this I think is different probably in Pittsburgh, but there's a lot of cross currents of what corporations are pushing us to do, and often it's deregulatory in some cases. Sometimes certainly we get lobbying and push to move in this direction, but a lot of it's kind of trailing, not leading.
Yeah, Will, what are you experiencing in Pittsburgh in terms of private sector?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same in Pittsburgh, right? I mean, Pennsylvania is in a situation where we're sitting on top of one of the world's largest deposits of natural gas, and so we always have the pressure from that industry, the various jobs that it creates, sort of away from carbon reduction. I think one thing that's interesting is that for municipal governments, the financial world, the bond markets are very important to municipal finances, and increasingly, I think there's a recognition that your ability, maybe a little less on the mitigation side, but your ability to adapt to climate change will affect your ability to get affordable financing as a municipal government. And so you cannot operate as a local government without at least grappling with the effects of climate change. And so I think it does force you to do that a little bit. And then, at a local level, there are these things that we don't always think of as climate policy, but kind of development policy and land use policy are very much tied up in the politics of local real estate development. And so I don't think that those politics have started to be climate focused yet, but I think that's a direction that we're probably going to see things move a little more as people figure out how local discussions about housing affordability and transportation mesh with our necessary climate actions.
Okay. So I had given Deborah Roberts some advance notice that this was going to come, so this isn't putting her too much on the spot. But if someone could bring her a microphone. So Deborah, you're a scientist, you're a practitioner, you're a municipal official, you are a co-chair of a working group of the IPCC. So you've got how many feet do you have? You've got them in lots of different areas. Your thoughts, responses to any of the conversation that we've had so far?
Yeah, that makes me sound like an octopus, doesn't it? Interesting categorization. I think, if we take the conversations we've had and look at what this all means for the 27th set of negotiations, to my mind, that in itself is a problem. We shouldn't be 27 years into this process and still be in a situation where we are questioning the outcome of the global process to tackle the climate change challenge. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me that I think the agenda that we see emerging for Egypt is a barometer of frustration from the global south. And you can see this if you listen to the Egyptian presidency. They're very strong on issues of implementation. And certainly in Working Group 2, we were very alive to the fact that no policymaker wants to hear about risk anymore. We've been there, we've done that, we know that. And we've moved the scientific assessment into the world of solutions, and we spent a lot of time, certainly in Working Group 2, trying to give policymakers a sense of what the science says about the feasibility and enabling conditions linked to those solutions. So we don't just provide a shopping list, but we provide a way of policymakers prioritizing that shopping list for their region, for their context, which is what we've heard. So
I think implementation is going to be a big push at this COP. The Global South wants to see action. Quite simply, we're tired of talking. We're tired of being told we have to be resilient. We don't see why we have to be resilient, and there's sufficient resources in the world to create a more equitable society. It's going to be a case of show me the money. 27 years on, it's still show me the money. And I think there's going to be a lot of tension around the discussions linked to the new quantified goal on finance, which we are meant to see in 2025, because we know that the Global North has failed to deliver the 100 billion, and that's recorded in the IPCC assessments. So I think there'll be a lot of tension around that. I think there's going to be a lot of tension around adaptation financing, which is something Working Group 2 called out, because there's a commitment from Glasgow to double that from 2019 to 2025, and all the indications are that that's not going to happen. And I think the big bone of contention in the Show Me the Money show is going to be the financial mechanism associated with loss and damage. So certainly that was a loss for the Global South in Glasgow. That will come back. And I think that will create a lot of tension in that space, particularly in this economic climate, because this is a different economic world to the one we had in Glasgow. So I think that's going to be important. I think it's going to be a COP on African soil, and we are going to require that is acknowledged. Africa is one of the most vulnerable places in the world, so I think there's going to be a big spotlight on Africa and African issues. Again, I think the IPCC stands ready to give guidance there. We've got a very strong chapter in Working Group 2 on Africa. There's going to be a big push on urban, because we'll have for the first time an urban ministerial. So this is the first time that the government's going to turn around and look to cities. And again, I think you've seen from the discussions over the last 2 or 3 days that the IPCC science and the assessment we've done stands ready to inform that. We're also going to see, at a side event, the IPCC has taken up the challenge of communication. We know we can't get everywhere by ourselves, so we're producing derivative products in partnership. We releasing together with a whole host of local government and other organizations a summary for urban policymakers. We've extracted the science for urban areas and making it ready for policymakers to use. So I think that's an important moment in the negotiations. We're beginning to localize. So the important points that Ko drew out about local communities working at city level together, we're providing the science that can enable that discussion amongst national governments. So I think that's important. As a South African, there's going to be an important moment for our country, because we're going to announce the way we're going to give effect to the just transition, the clean energy transition that was agreed for financing at Glasgow at the end of last year. So we'll reveal that plan. That's an important moment, because that's meant to set the template for equivalent action, potentially in Indonesia and so on. But you'll notice again strong concerns around the money. So that $8.5 billion US, we've spent basically a year trying to figure out what form that money will take. Because if it's simply in loans, it'll make us more indebted. We don't want that. It appears to be concessional loans and grants, so that I think will be a big moment. But I think if none of these things come together to meet the expectations of the Global South in terms of meaningful change around financial support, in terms of meaningful acknowledgement of loss and damage, in terms of meaningful acknowledgement of the need for implementation, I think we will see a world in which multilateralism in the climate change space is at real risk, because I think the temperament of the Global South is one of, we'll give you one last chance, but if not, we may not be coming back to this table in the same engaged way. So I think this is a dangerous moment. I think this is a big COP, because I think at Glasgow there was a lot to gain. In Egypt there's a lot to lose. So I think we need to be cautious of it.
That's a very sobering observation. All right, so now's your chance for those, let's start off if there's any students who have a question or you have a perspective that you would like to share. And we'll turn the microphones over to you for a little bit, and then we'll let our panelists see if they want to respond to any of what they hear. Here's in the center here, we've got one. Get your hands up high. One up there, one there. Okay. Yes. Can you also run a mic? Be ready to take a mic there. Take the one up there. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Carrie. I'm a poli-sci major. I have a question for you, and thank you for this whole conference. I acknowledge the emphasis on urban areas, but as someone who lives in a very rural agriculture area that's full of mono-agriculture and soybeans, I have to drive 30 minutes to a grocery store. How can I stay hopeful and active in the climate change community when the infrastructure in my area is lacking, as well as the local politics?
All right, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's have another comment over or question from over here.
I have a comment, but I'm happy to have that question answered first.
Go ahead and answer that question. Anybody want to respond to the question about, there's been a lot of emphasis on urban areas, cities, rural areas are also going to be strongly affected. Any of our panelists want to take a shot at that?
I can give a sort of self-serving answer, if that's all right. So I think engaging with your local politics is important, right? Because I think there are people, while often sort of more rural areas look monolithic on these issues, there's always diversity of opinion. So if you're interested in, seeing, clean energy issues, climate issues addressed, talk to your legislator about it, right? I think people don't realize how, even in the governor's office, we're all sort of human beings that react to what we hear from constituents. And I think, at the local level, your township supervisor, your borough leader, your local member of the House of Representatives, they have small districts. They're, paying attention to the car dealer in their community and the kind of school superintendent, but they're also paying attention to those local folks and constituents who are reaching out to them, and it all kind of changes the conversation. So I think engaging in that way, no matter where you are, is really important. And I think the conversation is changing. There's sort of this circuit of energy conferences that's happening all the time, and at the beginning of our administration, we were always having these sort of fossil fuel versus clean energy conversations at these conferences. And the more that I've sort of gone to, the more it is sort of a synergy of those two. So colleagues from redder states are talking about how clean energy, how windmill installation and solar farms can be real opportunities for rural growth and economy. And we see that here in the state also, where members of districts that are more rural are becoming interested in these issues because they see the way that a large solar field can bring back an abandoned mine site and make it usable land that's contributing to the tax base and these things. So I think things are shifting, and I think the more that those voices from people that that care about these issues are making it into the process, the more things will change.
Yeah, I'd also like to share, one of my students this semester is very much interested in issues of rural development and how climate, other pressures are affecting rural areas. And she shared with me, this was new to me, that there is at Dickinson, there's kind of a rural affinity group where students who come from kind of rural areas, less urban areas, they kind of feel isolated here at Dickinson. And so there is an emerging group of students who are trying to connect with each other and talk about what sort of issues are they facing, whether it's in their rural areas or just kind of being acknowledged and recognized here at Dickinson in this thriving metropolis of Carlisle. But related to that is, and I can connect with you later, she was telling me that some of the students at Dickinson who are doing this are involved in a national conference that's being organized for rural students. I don't remember the full details of what's going on, but I can connect you with that student. I'm also just sharing, I'll just share with you that students who I worked with last fall did an assessment of climate change vulnerability and adaptation for Cumberland County, which is largely a rural area. It includes a lot of information about things that can be done at the rural level, and I'd be happy to share that with you. Yes.
has now formed into a bit more of a question, but one of the most pressing issues beyond what we're currently addressing is the language and the ways in which we use to address it, because so constantly we find policymakers making this statement that we only have 3 months left until X, Y, and Z occurs. We have 12 months left until X, Y, and Z occurs. 12 months later, we are still at that point where, sure, local, state, federal, and other community stakeholders and organizations have made change, but we still only have 12 months left. It's an indefinite period of time where we will only have 12 months left. And there are many people and researchers that do address this. Robin Wall Kimmer addresses it in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, a bit, in the language of how we discuss climate change and discuss our relationship to nature and the linear passage of time. But I'm wondering, in what ways do you think it's possible to change the language in how we are currently talking about climate change, to make it seem that while yes, we may only have 12 months left before X happens, it is not a hard stop. It can go beyond that. But what we don't want to do is stretch out this rubber band of language where it's still the same size and just expanding it until one day it will snap and we will reach that point. And I'm essentially asking, what space and capacity do you think there is to change the language around that in the IPCC report, but also in places like Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh and local communities?
Thank you for that. That's a really, really insightful observation of, we constantly talk about these things this way. Who would like to respond to that? I'm
ready to jump into that one, but I bet Fatima has a perspective on this as well, as do you guys probably. Yeah, I take your point. It's like, at what point are we just seem to be kind of crying wolf, right? And the truth is that the science is not as precise as to say that there is a demarcation at 1.5 as opposed to 1.55 or 1.6, and often these numbers are kind of used to drive ambition, and in some sense are not entirely arbitrary because there is science behind it. But the Paris Agreement was as much below 2 degrees as it could be or something, and now we're talking about 1.5. So what happened in those years? But I think, in the IPCC context, we have started to message that every fraction of a degree matters, right? So it's not so much about these lines in the sand, but it is true that as we warm, the impacts grow. And I think maybe that's one way that we've tried to change our communications on it, because your point is very valid.
Will or Fatima, do either of you want to respond to this? The language around.
Yeah, at least from where I sit, I think the word climate emergency is not a hyperbole. I think it is real here, because people actually live it, they see it, they feel it. The oceans are warming. We are looking at land degradation at a level that we have not seen before. And it's having dire consequences on farmers, on food chains, supply chains. So that, coupled with extreme weathers that are becoming, weather patterns that are becoming more frequent, I think these are all proximity issues. They are actually experiential issues that are seen and lived on a daily basis. So most people here would not ask you what climate change is about, because they know it, they see it, and they feel it. So I think that's a difference. But I do agree with the point that you made, that at some point we might need to be a bit more precise, because climate deniers are using this as well. So basically, you've been talking about this horrible situation that's going to happen, and how come we're still where we are now, So I think we need to be mindful of how we can use it in a way that would bring the urgency for action, but at the same time not make it look like it's spinning out and spinning out and spinning out, and we're still talking about it. One thing that somebody mentioned to me, the IPCC has an expression in most of its report about the window of opportunity is there, but it's closing. And one observer mentioned to me, how come the IPCC keeps saying that the window of opportunities is closing? And I said, but it is closing, So yes, I mean, I agree with Ko that we need more precise language, but it's hard to be, some people feel that language is already quite alarmist. But I guess we do need to be mindful of the fact that this can also be exploited in the other way, by climate deniers.
Yeah. It's also, we talk about global average temperature, which is basically meaningless to most of us, right? I mean, right now the temperature may be okay in a moderate climate, but even this temperature in Alaska is 4 times the warming of the global average, and so I think that's also a piece of this for us to consider. It really is place dependent.
So there's a question that came from the virtual audience that's related to this, and I'll kind of reframe it a little bit to get it more onto the same issue. It comes from James, where he's observing that according to the 6th assessment report, emissions must peak by 2025 if we were to have a chance of limiting warming to less than 1.5 degrees. But we barely budget the needles, so can we realistically stay optimistic that we can stay below 1.5 degrees? So maybe, Will, do you have some thoughts on sort of in conversations with people in Pittsburgh of this sort of framing around, does this become problematic of if we don't, we've got this very short window, this closing window that, if we miss this, we're going to exceed warming of 1.5 or whatever, and we're past a point where that's feasible anymore. Is this part of the conversation in Pittsburgh, and how do you deal with this issue of language and?
I don't think it is here, and I mean I think it's partly because we're in one of those places that is more fortunately situated with regard to the effects of climate change in other places. So we're going to see the effects we'll see will be problematic, but not as catastrophic as in other places. We don't deal with sea level rise. It's not so warm here already that increased temperatures will make it unlivable. I think just more broadly that, what I'm sort of focused on in our work is less about meeting specific targets than just demonstrating the capacity for action and showing people concrete ways to move in the right direction. That if we can show people that there are ways to reduce our emissions while simultaneously actually making our lives better, that you build momentum that way. I think too much of our framing is about the sacrifices that we have to make, whereas as a city dweller who cares about land use and transportation and other things, completely aside from the climate implications, there are good arguments to be made for doing the kinds of things we need to do to reduce emissions. Reducing single occupancy vehicle travel makes for better, more enjoyable cities. Having denser development close to job centers makes for more affordable housing and addresses our affordable housing crisis. So I think that's where I'm focused, is on how to demonstrate that we can do something and just to get people started doing something. I mean, I think of it as like, if you're in a boat that's filling with water, I'm not interested in arguing about whether, me personally bailing water out of the boat is going to be enough to keep the boat from sinking, or, are we going to get this much water out by some time? It's like, we have to start getting water out of the boat right now. Let's just talk about what's the way to get water out of the boat right now. And then we can figure out the details a little later on once we're all actually moving water.
Thank you. All right, so we're all going to start moving some water. Let's take another comment, questions from the audience. Be brave, challenge us, be controversial. Let's up here and there and then down in the front.
Thank you again for being here. Mr. Robinson, you said earlier that pessimism often leads to inaction, and as inaction travels down from the federal to state to local levels, it gets more and more difficult to increase action in the communities. How do we prevent that inaction, and how do we build enough momentum from the local and state levels to keep building that into federal and international levels?
Okay, so let's hold that. We'll take a couple more, so you'd be ready with a response on how do we deal with that pessimism and move to action. So I think you had a question as well, or a comment?
My question was about a lot of times, and this is something that Fatima actually mentioned in the last panel, but a lot of times people sort of have the, I guess, false notion that sustainable development is bad for the economy in some way, or that using fossil fuels is going to be better for the economy, whereas it might be more accurate to say that using fossil fuels is sort of taking a mortgage out on the future of the economy. Is this something that you have any way of conveying to people in a beneficial way and getting through people's heads so that they understand that this isn't actually going to help your economy in the long term? It's just something that's going to help for a very short term until it is going to cause a much bigger problem.
All right, very astute observation. We'll come to that in a moment. And I think we had one up here in the front.
When I look at the maps of what's likely to be coming in the next 50 to 100 years, it looks to me like vast regions will become inhospitable to human life, including much of the American Southwest. So specifically for Sam and Will, is anyone at the state and local level preparing for example, doubling Pennsylvania's population? Because if the American Southwest becomes unlivable, that means either lots of people are going to die, or lots of people are going to move north, or both. So is anyone even talking about that?
All right. So any of our panelists or Deborah want to respond to any of the above? One was directed right to you, Sam, so why don't you go ahead with that?
Yeah, I think maybe to kind of draw a through line between a couple of those, they're sort of about messaging and how do we effectively message, and there are great things that have been sort of written about that. To my mind, it really, we have seen, I think, a long-term trend where environmental issues are sort of falling down the rank of priority in people's voting lists. That's an unfortunate reality that makes my life harder as the kind of enviro guy in the governor's administration, as we're competing for resources and as we're competing for attention to the issues. Politicians are responsive to voters. So I think part of that in the climate threat is that this is a bit abstract, right, for folks. It is, if that's because of the time scale that we're talking about and that we're on, that it's always 100 years out. We have a window that's 100 years. If that's because people aren't seeing it, directly in their lives in Pittsburgh in the way that they would in some parts of the global South, or in many parts of the global South, unfortunately. I think our challenge is to make, instead of having it be abstract and talk about 1.5 degrees, or talking about kind of like the urgency of the timeline, or trying to scare people into action. I think it's one, being concrete about the changes that farmers are seeing in their growing season and the flooding that is hitting parts of the Commonwealth that have never had it before, and so you're kind of trying to make it real for folks in their lives, because I think people do respond when they make that connection. And second is to talk about the opportunities, which I think that there are in the sustainable and clean energy economies, there are significant opportunities. Particularly, we'll again thank the federal government for showering us with money, because it's going to make the work a lot easier, and make those opportunities a lot easier to grasp. But talking about how we can add to the economy of Pittsburgh if we build out some of the infrastructure in the IIJA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think it's those kind of opportunities. I will say I don't think we haven't done huge amounts of planning for a climate migration at this point. Although we certainly hear, I think the mayor of Erie has talked about how livable Erie is going to be, and people are making the play to attract people that want to move north. So, certainly an issue that we'll have to grapple with. But Pennsylvania is not the densest state. We can take some more folks, and I think there are some opportunities there actually for us to add population and build economy. So,
can I just ask, who here thinks about climate change when you think where you will move next? Yeah, right. The maps are out there, and it's maybe not on the tip of people's tongue. We do have in the federal government, we have a task force that's looking at migration. But if you really want to think about this issue, look at the Pacific Islands or some of the small island states and Australia and New Zealand, who many of their citizens are losing their ancestral homes. So it's very much front of mind for them, for sure.
Anyone want to take a shot at the question about the sort of dichotomous framing of sustainable development, environmental benefits, but not good for jobs in the economy, or framing it as, well, fossil fuels are somehow better for the economy? Anybody want to take a shot at that one? One thing I'll just observe is, on a basic level of thinking about, in the United States, I think it's estimated that burning fossil fuels causes about 100,000 premature deaths a year. I think any time the conversation is, being framed as one of somehow burning fossil fuels, we can't afford to give them up, they're too important for our economy. What about those premature deaths? That's important. Globally, I think the annual death rate from air pollution, this isn't just from fossil fuel burning, but air pollution, I think it's in the order of like 6 million premature deaths a year, something like that. It's a major thing. Okay. Quick follow-up on the same thing?
To answer that question, I think similar things have been said about previous technological leaps. We can't give up horses. We can't give up trains. We can't give up telephones. The difference this time is that we're being forced into it by our own waste products. But really, what we're talking about with renewable energy is an exciting new technology that is better. It's better in ways beyond just for the environment. If you've driven an electric car, you know what I'm talking about.
It's peppy.
Any comments, questions from this side? Deborah, why don't you go ahead there?
I don't think there's any argument with that, but I think it goes back to a point that Fatima indicated, is that the move to the use of renewable comes at a cost too. And somehow I think we always make this assumption that this transition is without impact. It has very real impacts, as Fatima indicated. I mean, if you look at a country like South Africa, large portions of our employment are linked to mines and extraction of resources like coal. Our economy is, in many cases, still linked to a strong mining base. And so South Africa has always said we're prepared to be ambitious. But the thing is, we need support in terms of technology transfer, and there you always hit the wall of intellectual property rights, in terms of capacity building, and in terms of finance. Now, think about the South African position. So we're being used as a pilot to affect this transition to the clean economy. So the countries who've come to the table, the US included, the UK, the EU, have put $8.5 billion on the table. We estimate it's going to cost us $250 billion to make that transition. And that's the problem. You've got people whose immediate lives and survival, because as Fatima indicated, for us, it's not just a question of quality of life, it's a question of life and death. And that's a much starker choice. And there's a lot of political power linked to this, because a politician is in power for 5 years. If that $250 billion US dollars is not immediately on the table, you can't guarantee your constituency that they will survive to the next day because there's a guaranteed job. And I think this is what we're not thinking about, is that these transitions are complex and they're expensive and they require all of us to be working together. But quite frankly, there's a stark lack of empathy in the world. You know, I wonder how many people in Pennsylvania actually care that they're about to declare a monster famine in the Horn of Africa, where people are dying because of climate change. You know, and that's my worry. We all talk about policies and actions that look after ourselves, but I think the big message from the Working Group 2 report is you are not safe anywhere. Because if inequity continues at the rate at which it exists in this world, and our assessment shows us it's increasing, no one will be safe because your supply chains depend on us. We're the resource-rich countries of the world. And if our countries become dysfunctional, you will become dysfunctional. And so I think, you know, we can't afford to be myopic. We can't only afford to look at the local areas. People in this room have to be concerned about continents like Africa. You have to be prepared to give up stuff to ensure that Africans live. And that's the challenge I put to you. How many of you are actually prepared to give up your freedom of choice to ensure that people you will never meet, places you will never see, will be resilient and sustainable? And that's the problem, is I don't think as a society we are there yet.
Ben, and then the gentleman behind him.
Thanks. And to build on Deborah's comment, I think, you know, she mentioned this word complexity, and the biggest frustration I have in the climate change discourse is our inability to sort of embrace nuance. You know, we're used to talking about all of these very, very complex issues in sound bites, more jobs, less jobs, et cetera. And, you know, multiple things can be true at the same time and in conflict. So, you know, the U.S. economy, one of the biggest economies in the world, lots of prosperity, a lot of which gets exported along with externalities, is a fossil fuel-driven economy, you know, at this moment in time, and that's the truth. But if you look at where growth is happening, it's overwhelmingly in the renewable energy sector. I mean, the vast majority of additional energy capacity being added is from renewables, which means the vast majority of new energy jobs in this country is coming from renewables. So that is an opportunity. That's something we should celebrate, and gives us an indication that there's some opportunities there, but there's still this vast infrastructure that we still need. And to add to that, I think, you know, back to Deborah's comment, I mean, thinking about this at the individual level. This is why I always find these arguments about, you know, jobs somewhat weak, because they're not just jobs, they're somebody's job, right? It's an individual's job somewhere, and telling that person, that's okay, we're creating a whole other set of jobs, you know, in Southern California with renewable energy, does not help somebody who put food on the table, who's a coal miner in Eastern Pennsylvania or West Virginia. And so when we gloss over, exactly to Deborah's point, when we gloss over these complexities and these nuances, it makes it impossible to find solutions that are actually going to work for everybody. And if we don't find solutions that work for everybody, we're just going to perpetuate inequities in quote unquote solving the problem, or we're not going to solve it at all.
So this is not a new problem. It's been around for decades, and it seems to repeat a cycle. We have a meeting, there are promises made to be altruistic, we need to do this, we need to do that, promptly followed by political expediency, which leads us into a heathenistic path where we make the wrong choices. Have we finally, I have two questions for anybody who wants to answer. Have we finally reached the tipping point where we will break that cycle? And when we break that cycle, what do we need to do to be a practical, realistic solution?
So would anybody like to take that on? We heard from Deborah earlier about, if we don't make some significant progress at this upcoming COP, that multilateralism is at risk. It's a dangerous moment. Can we get away from this cycle of promises and then inaction and lack of following through? I don't know that we can solve this problem in this room, but some thoughts on that. Emily, directly on this?
So I feel like a lot of the conversations that we've been having have been coming around to the question of how do you put political pressure on politicians. So I resist the word we, actually, right? Because I feel like, sure, and I think it makes sense in the IPCC context, but in some ways it makes sentences that are a little bit confusing. Like we in this room would really like to make some quite different choices. The people who are pushing against who are weakening political will or who are pretending to political will are a different group of people who we need to, combat and put pressure on. So I'm wondering, one avenue that we haven't talked very much about, although we have raised it in a sort of, occasionally we've mentioned the name Greta Thunberg. And I'm wondering what place protest and civil disobedience and keep it in the ground movements and all of these grassroots movements that we've seen that in the US have had quite a significant effect on keeping carbon in the ground. And, before the Paris Agreement, there were mass marches. Under the Trump administration, there were mass marches. I think a lot of people in this room were actually recruited to this conversation through mass marches. And I'm not saying that's the only mode. I think we've talked quite a bit about municipal rooms in which we're going to have conversations. And I'm always, send the students to as many boring rooms as possible, to be as loud as possible in quiet spaces. I think that's great. But I'm wondering kind of what are the less polite modes of putting pressure on the systems, and where do we see those having an effect? So how are we potentially able to hold politicians to an account in addition to voting?
So how do we hold politicians to account being a little less polite, maybe a lot less polite? She wasn't named, but I think it was Fatima who made a comment that I think was referencing Farhana Yamin, who has gotten herself arrested a couple of times, international environmental lawyer. Thoughts on civil disobedience, disruptive behavior? Anybody willing to talk about that publicly? Yes. And then afterwards, we got a couple of over here on the far right.
I think one of the things to consider with this, and this is less of an answer and more of just a statement, is in civil disobedience movements we've seen in the past and the issues that they revolve around, almost always we've seen them revolve around an identity and something very concrete. We can think about, race and class. We can think about gender. And those are much more concrete than when we're examining this in the context of Earth and Mother Nature and a variety of other terms we could use to prescribe this issue to. And I think it might be almost more challenging to equitably and personally respectfully acknowledge that while that can be effective, it's not going out and harming the environment in response, because that would be very easy to do. And it would be very easy to make a statement by doing that. However, that is contrary to what I think is kind of being described in the goals which we strive to achieve. And I believe there's a balance that has to be figured out, and how do we respect the land and the spaces that we are fighting for in ways that may not be as socially acceptable or polite, without doing anything that farther harms them or polarizes the communities that unite around these spaces and lands.
Okay. I think we had another over here, Natalia.
Thank you all for joining us in this really insightful conversation. I think just adding on to your wonderful points, Lucy, is that, of course, civil disobedience, there is room for that, and we can be loud and clear about what we want and what we need in terms of environmental justice, environmental equity. But on top of that, it's also about civic engagement of those marginalized groups. It's about empowering them in ways with not just knowledge, but also the access to be able to interact with, the climate and energy manager of Pittsburgh. I would not have had this opportunity if I didn't go to PWI like Dickinson, and we need to be able to have these conversations facilitated, and we need to have the correct and often marginalized voices involved in those discussions that do move us forward. And it sort of goes into a question that I have for both William and Samuel. How do we ensure that those voices are equitably a part of our conversations, but they're also a part of the process that in developing and also distributing the resources, the funds for projects that help build climate resilience in our communities?
So you directed your question for Sam and Will?
Sure. So I think it's the big challenge of the moment, or one of the big challenges of the moment, is this sort of environmental justice discussion that I think you've been having today. But from our perspective, I mean, this will sound like a sort of trite political phrase, but the idea of meeting people where they are is so incredibly important in this conversation. I'm a 8 to 5, 8 to 6 kind of employee of the state. So I'm working during a set schedule. We assume that the folks that we want to meet with, can take off from their busy lives in the middle of the day and meet with us. And in many cases in the environmental justice communities, the frontline communities that we're trying to reach and have these dialogues with, it's just not realistic to expect that, right? We can't expect people to meet with us on our schedule. We need to meet them on theirs. So just as one small example, trying to do more night meetings and just make it really easier for people that have busy lives outside of their environmental activism or their community activism, I think is a piece of it. It is, it's that and 50 other ways that we need to do a better job of communicating in simpler language that's less bureaucratic when we're talking about how regulations work or how grant guidance works. It's making those grant-making applications simpler and reducing paperwork. There's a lot of it. I think of environmental justice significantly as sort of the hard work of translating our good intentions to work with communities that are overburdened and disadvantaged, translating that into kind of the bureaucratic language of government and particularly environmental regulation. Real challenge. There's sort of bureaucratic inertia inside the government itself to continue to do it the way that we've been doing it. But there's also these sort of good intentions. I think we're making slow work at it, but it's something that we're working towards.
Will, did you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think sometimes you have to de-emphasize the environmental aspect or the climate aspect. That there are, especially from a local government perspective, there are in Pittsburgh things that are much more pressing issues for people than the immediate effects of climate change, but that are, like I said before, are connected to climate change and to climate action. And if you, I think, relinquish having climate at the center of the conversation, you can allow for more organic activist movements to push for changes that will have positive climate impacts, but that are not driven exclusively by climate politics. And I think, I don't think we're there yet in Pittsburgh. I think you've seen in other places, Los Angeles, for example, had changes in their building codes to lead to more energy efficient buildings that were driven very much from an environmental and social justice activist base in a way that helped, propel that forward, that I don't think could happen if you were just talking about it from a more technocratic, high efficiency buildings advocacy kind of way. So I think that's part of it is thinking differently about what the driving messages are and allowing other messages to help carry your climate goals.
So we're down to the last few minutes of the symposium. So what I'd like to do is ask all of our panelists and Deborah as well, if you'd like to, do you have some closing thoughts, minute or so each, that you'd like to share, something that you'd want to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet? Ko, do you?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up something from that last conversation because, I mean, obviously I've worked in government my entire career. I'm not the revolutionary who's pushing the envelope. I'm often trying to find the practical solutions from working within government. But I will say that those who do push the envelope make it possible for us to do things we never imagined possible in government. The idea that we now have real money going towards climate justice is a result of people who are pushing the envelope from the outside. The government would not have gotten to that place. So I just want to maybe encourage folks to think about what is possible in kind of that revolutionary mode, because it really matters.
Sam, you got?
No, I think that's a great point. To the question about sort of civil disobedience and how do we create effective change, I think it's all of those things at once, right? As a person who has been protested, and who has accepted petitions, and also as a person who has protested themselves, and signed or collected petitions. I think it's important, and those things do matter, and it is really important to be strategic and focus your actions in the right direction, and to get change. But I think it all matters, and I think to Ko's point, it has really created more space for these topics in state and federal government. The fact that there are people working and organizing around them really does shift that Overton window that everybody talks about to make new things possible. So I think all of it is helpful.
Fatima, do you have a final thought or thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Maybe just to pull a few strands together on the civil disobedience discussion. I mean, I think, yes, that can definitely be a very powerful tool in bringing about change, but it depends where it's done. There are some societies where any form of disobedience is not allowed, and some governments are very allergic to civil disobedience. So again, it's a place of where and how. I think somebody made a comment around some of the advantages around, why fossil fuel is something that we have to, basically live in the ground and move away from. I think the fact that the more we are extracting these resources, the more we are drawing on these resources, the more we are losing our agricultural potential. And I know that agriculture has its own problems, but there are countries in Africa, for instance, that had very strong agricultural countries in terms of their productivity and potential, and have lost that because they became so involved in mining that they've lost that cover, they've lost that land cover, they've lost that potential to become, an agricultural country where they can actually become more productive, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that loss is sometimes very hard to recover. So it's something we need to think about. And Neil, I think you mentioned the aspect of indoor air pollution. I mean, I had a statistic where it was mentioned that indoor air pollution, is a bigger killer than malaria, and that's frightening. It's frightening because it also happens to women and children, because very often it's a silent killer, and it happens in homes where people can't afford anything else apart from biomass and wood fuel. So we're also not paying attention to the other part of the problem. We have to find solutions to clean cooking, because ultimately many women are losing their lives and children are losing their life because of indoor air pollution. But a bigger issue that I wanted to mention, and it's a point that Deborah mentioned, and I think mentioned in a very compelling way. There is a fatigue with these climate change discussions. We're at COP27. There is a really big fatigue, and people have a sense that, where is this going? If this was a baby, that baby would have left home a long time now, because this is 27 years later. It's a long time. But the other side of that discussion is that I get a sense sometimes that it's almost as if there's an how should I put it? There's an infantilization process here, where countries, especially in the global south, have been told what to do and how to do it. They've been treated like children. And I think that in itself is difficult, because, at some point you have sovereign nations that can decide where to go. And you're asking some countries to do something that hasn't been done before. Fossil fuel has been the motor of many economies. And what we are saying, basically, I know that I've been saying this, and many other people have been saying that this is not the way to go. You need to move away from fossil fuel, but it's not going to happen overnight. So the sense that this is easy, or the sense that this is a linear process, is straightforward, it's actually not true. It's not easy. They're hard choices. And that's why it's been 27 years when we are talking about this matter, because it's not an easy matter to resolve. It's about economics. And that's a big, and I'm not even talking about the capitalist word here, but it's about economics. It's not an easy matter. And right now, what we are seeing, and this is my last comment, is that we are seeing countries in Europe that are now paying to secure natural gas because they need alternatives to the problem in Ukraine. It's staggering, because at some point, everybody was saying that natural gas is something that you have to move away from. But there are countries in Europe now that are paying big monies to secure natural gas, and almost also secure it from possible, Islamist group, because there's a fair factor that, it might end up in the wrong hands. So these are some of the contradictions in the discussion that I think we need to be brave enough to look at. And to say that, this transition it needs to happen for everyone's sake. It needs to happen in Africa and the rest of the world. But we have to be able to find incentives as well, because people are not going to want to just transition right away, because this is also central to their development. And the examples and role models they're seeing outside the continent in other regions are not very good, But I have to say the opportunities are there. Opportunities for green jobs, opportunities not to come back and clean up. It's a big investment to start cleaning up. An opportunity to lead in a green way and make life for future generations more bearable and more, more livable. I think these are all good points to make. But one has to say that the mitigation burden that is being felt by the rest of the world cannot be, just transferred wholesale to another part of the world and then be expected to run in that race and get to a finish line when you were hardly part of how you got to that race. You were trying to figure that out. So many issues, Neil, and just to say thank you again for inviting me to this. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right.
Thank you.
Will, do you have a closing thought?
Yeah, my scope of work is much smaller than that. It's at the local level. The things we do at a local government, we as the city of Pittsburgh are not going to, on our own, make it much of a dent at all in the global climate. But I think it's important to remember that every little bit of policy is climate policy. We can no longer think of things in a vacuum, and the local level is where you often have the most influence. So it's important for everyone to just hold their local governments to account and make sure that when we're making transportation decisions, housing decisions, land use decisions, purchasing decisions, that none of that is neutral. and every decision is going to affect our carbon footprint. And so make sure to hold your leaders accountable that they're always taking that into account.
Deborah, would you like to have a closing word here?
Well, perhaps to bring it back to the IPCC, because that's why we all convened here. And I think the IPCC stands for an acknowledgement by society that science is an important way of knowing the world, of bringing evidence to bear on our decision-making. And I suppose my final plea would be to look at the IPCC reports for the hope that they do bring, because they do identify options, they give us a sense of which options might work in which context. But I think we've got to read these reports more deeply, particularly the reports of the sixth assessment cycle, because while they give hope, as I said in my keynote, they also give us a very real reality check. They indicate perhaps that the high road that we would all prefer that we were on in an equal and sustainable world might not materialize, and that we look potentially to a very suboptimal future for a very large proportion of the world. Remember, the world is split between 1 billion in the global north and almost 7 billion in the global south. And I think we've got to think about the toolkit that will allow us to keep moving in a suboptimal world. And I think we're going to have to be brave. We can't cop out and say we're depressed by that. We're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to stay in the room. We're going to have to find ways of working through that. Ultimately, we're going to have to find purpose in that challenge for that world. And I suppose that's the challenge I give to the Dickinson community, is pick up that challenge as it emerges. Find that purpose in that challenge. Find your role and know that it's going to be hard work. Stay in the room. Be brave. Be insightful, because that's what that suboptimal world will need. Thanks.
Thank you for that. So thinking about the challenge that Deborah raised a bit earlier, so some part of the knowledge that we have, things that we know include lives are at risk in Africa. People will die in Africa from climate hazards and climate change. People are dying in Africa from climate change. What are we willing to do about that? This is knowledge that you need to take with you and think about that, reflect on that. What will you do with that knowledge? Do we have that kind of empathy for people who are on another continent, living very different lives than those of us in this room? There may be people watching the virtual world where I'm speaking of others that might be them, but this is something we need to really take seriously. So this is the work of a lifetime, of many lifetimes. It's urgent, but it's not something that ends. This is something we really need to take on in a very forceful way. It's work that we need to do locally, nationally, globally. It's work that requires love. It requires empathy. It requires storytelling. And when done with others, it's work that is highly affirming. It builds community. It can build a purposeful hope. So choose to engage, choose to learn more, choose to participate, be active. And that would be my closing comment to you, other than thank you very much for taking the time that you spent with us in the room, the virtual audience, our panelist speakers, everyone who participated in this symposium. I am just deeply, deeply grateful for the time that you've given to this.